That's right. It's me again. So for the record, this is agenda item 26. I'm Taryn Fennessy, CWCB staff. This is the Colorado Drought Mitigation and Response Plan. This is an action item where staff is requesting approval of this drought plan. This is a very quick overview of what is an extremely comprehensive and long plan. So you should have received a link to the full 800 some odd pages. I'm sure you've read every single word of it. But stop me if you have any questions at any point, and I can either dive into the methodology or some of the pieces. But for the sake of time, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. Maybe. You know, why do you gotta? Yes, it's on. And it still doesn't work. All right. Well, while you do that. Okay, so what is the purpose of the drought plan? This is part of a broader effort. It's part of the all hazards mitigation plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it fits into that in a little bit. But it's really to provide an effective and effective system for response and mitigation efforts to reduce the impacts of drought in the state of Colorado. We know that we're going to experience drought in the state. We experience drought 9 out of every 10 years at some level in some portion of the state of Colorado. So it's really just to make it the systematic response go more smoothly when we do experience drought. And then also, thank you. And to help speed the process by which aid gets to folks on the ground and the communication up the chain as well. The mitigation effort is really focused on putting in practices that reduce the impact during the time or reduce the impact during an event, but the mitigation is focused during non-response periods. So we don't want to be focusing a whole lot on mitigation efforts when we're in full response mode. So we try to use those interludes of years to focus on mitigation efforts. So not this year. It's also coordinated with other state emergency plans. The all hazard plan, it fits in as part of that, just like the flood plan, which I believe you were presented on yesterday. And really just provides an operational structure because droughts impact different areas of the state at different interludes. Sometimes there's turnover in staff. And so it provides a structure by which people can refer to make sure that we have our bases covered in responding to drought. So why do we update this plan? Well, basically because FEMA tells us we have to. That's one reason. It increases or it maintains our eligibility at the county level when the all hazards plans are updated every 5 years and approved by FEMA. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on what worked and what didn't work and incorporate lessons learned. It gives us an opportunity to re-engage with stakeholders and folks that are engaged on drought issues in a more meaningful way so that we can build programs and procedures that are more effective. It also gives us an opportunity to incorporate the latest available science. Climate change has been incorporated into our drought plan. We were the first state in the nation to do that since 2010 when we first comprehensively overhauled the drought plan, and we've continued to expand on how we deal with climate change each time we update this. So the last time we updated this was 5 years ago, and this reflects lessons learned through the 2013 drought, which was the last time we updated it was in fall of 2014, 5 years ago. No, I guess it was in 2013. So through that drought that kind of culminated in 2014, and also kind of improve the decision-making process. So the tools and resources that are available to help decision makers. And this time we really focused on tools and resources to help decision makers at the local level. And I'll get more into that. Benefits of an updated drought plan. This is kind of consistent with all hazard mitigation planning, reduced losses, better coordination, reduced liability, making sure that we're not duplicating at the state level, that we're leveraging federal resources, that we're coordinating, and increasing collaboration with our local partners as well. So what's in this plan? I've mentioned a couple of these already. We do this collaboratively. So we create a stakeholder committee that helps us look at what we need to update with the plan and then provide input into that. We update the vulnerability assessment Colorado was the first state in the nation to have a quantitative and qualitative vulnerability assessment. Most other states just do a qualitative vulnerability assessment, and we've been the model. Not just for other states within the US, but also a couple of European nations have come to us to use our vulnerability method, vulnerability assessment method as the basis for their plans too. So it's really given us an opportunity to be a leader in drought mitigation and response nationally or internationally as well. And then also we update the indices and drought indicators that we use to inform our decision-making process based on new ones that are coming out. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then this drought visualization pilot project is a new component that we incorporated this year, and I'll go through that. So these are the plan elements. Like I said, it's about 800 pages. It's pretty long, but we do have a pullout section, Annex A, that is really the how-to for response. And that really outlines when we are responding to a drought, how we do it and what are the policies and procedures in place, who engages, and how those mechanisms work. And so we've been using that annex a lot this year. But then we also have the drought vulnerability assessment, which breaks it down into different sectors. Those sectors are listed here. And those are at the county level. You'll see that in just a minute. And so those can be tools and resources for folks within those sectors who want to look at drought planning or drought incorporation into their decision-making process, as well as counties or municipalities that want to do that as well. Climate change, I mentioned we update the indices every single time. And then there's a couple of appendices that we do because FEMA requires us to, like the list of stakeholders and folks that engage in the planning process. We do also go out to public comment with this for a 30-day period. So we try to get stakeholder engagement from those in the public as well. The update every 5 years also gives us an opportunity to align it with other state planning processes, many of which have been updated since then. The Colorado Water Plan, the Colorado Climate Plan. It is an annex to the multi-hazard plan, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The Colorado Resiliency Framework hadn't been completed last time we did it. We've included that. And then some of our efforts that we've done with drought response, including our portal website. So we try to coordinate and streamline those as well. So the process for this, we've got our own standalone drought mitigation and response plan that feeds into the state's all hazard mitigation plan that then goes to the governor for approval. Assuming you all approve it, will happen next month. It will then go to FEMA for approval. And assuming FEMA approves it before the end of the year, then we'll maintain eligibility for resources from the federal government, which is a good thing. So now I'm going to dive into some of the pieces of the plan and talk about some of the changes that we've made. This is the summary of our drought indices. So we use numeric indicators to help us decide when we need to act and respond and how severe a drought is. But these are guidelines. They are not hard and steadfast rules because every drought responds differently. And sometimes, depending on the timing of a drought, you can see more or less impacts. And as a drought becomes more and more prolonged, you see more and more impacts regardless of what the conditions are. For example, southwestern Colorado has been a D4, which is the highest level on the U.S. Drought Monitor since April, May of this year. It can't get any worse on the Drought Monitor, but the impacts kind of mount as the longer you stay in that phase. And so it really does help us make decisions, but it also gives us some sidebars on how does this rank in comparison to other droughts that we've seen. It gives us some information on how the drought is relative to different characteristics and gives us some fun stats that we can reference as far as, Olathe had the thirstiest year on record this year, things like that. And so we rely on a number of different indices, and we've expanded this over the years The last update we did 5 years ago, we incorporated the U.S. Drought Monitor officially as one of our indicators. This is a compound indicator in that it uses a multitude of different numeric indices to feed into the maps that you see that are really easy to interpret. We then use the Palmer, the SWASI, which is not to be confused with the other SWASI process. This SWASI has existed longer, but it's a surface water supply index that the state engineer's office calculates every single month, and then precipitation as well. What's not on here that we also factor in pretty heavily is temperature, and that's something that's become increasingly more important. So that helps us inform when we need to respond and when we need to act. When I first got hired onto CWCB 10 years ago, the diagram for how to respond was basically a spaghetti plot that you needed an advanced degree to understand how it worked, and no one ever used it because no one understood who was supposed to be talking to who, when, and how, or about what. And so we've streamlined this process, and over the years, we've actually decreased the number of impact task forces that exist. So we have a standing water availability task force that's co-chaired by CWCB and the Division of Water Resources. That meets almost every single month and is our monitoring arm. But then we also have agriculture, energy, municipal, and wildlife impact task forces that are activated as needed during times of drought. So currently, for the 40 counties that are activated within the state of Colorado for the existing drought, it's activated only for the agricultural sector, because that's where we've been seeing the most impacts. In the past, we have also activated for the municipal sector. I could see that should this drought persist, which it won't, we would activate for other impact task forces as needed. Then we have a drought task force. This is largely a cabinet level senior staff group that kind of directs and oversees the response. Really what we're trying to do at that drought task force level is address any widespread issues before they become crises. And to help facilitate the response. This has been activated again since May of this year. We did a drought tour earlier this year as part of that. And that is the group that also feeds directly up to the governor's office and the governor himself to make sure that there is a continual flow of information, both up and down the chain. And it's been a really good process. We feel like we've got our heads wrapped around this process now that we've put it through a couple of droughts. So in addition to that, the drought plan lays out specifically who should engage on these task forces and what they should do. This is an example from the drought plan of who our lead agencies and core participants are, as well as some of the supporting stakeholders. We get pretty good representation throughout the year from all of these stakeholders in the Ag Impact Task Force. Then we also go a step further and lay out some of the tasks. The idea being that if someone is unable to, if there's job turnover, and someone is not familiar with the processes by which we respond to drought, they could pull out this annex and really it lays out the structure for them. It also lays out what impacts we should be looking at, because the impact task forces largely exist to collect data and information on impacts so that we can best use our limited resources to reduce the impacts in the future. So now I'm going to dive into the vulnerability assessment and what we do in our vulnerability assessment. And I'll give you just a quick overview of this. I said that this is a horrible slide. Sorry, you can't really read any of those words. Just take my word for it that they say what I tell you they say. It's a qualitative and quantitative assessment. So what we do is we do a big lit search to make sure that we have all the data and information necessary for county level information at the across the state in all of the sectors and subsectors. But then we use a qualitative approach where we actually meet with folks on the ground to see whether or not we should adjust those scores that we come up with to a higher or lower number based on the adaptive capacity that we as people have to respond to drought. So for one example, in 2002, there was a lot of talk about how quantitatively fisheries would have been heavily impacted by the 2002 drought, but because CPW staff were able to relocate some of those fisheries and respond differently, their loss of those assets was actually very limited. And so that's the type of adjustment that we can do, knowing how it actually plays out in practice. We try to keep this pretty updated as to what people's capabilities are within each of the sectors. So this is kind of what that qualitative analysis or quantitative analysis looks like. It is a weighted score. Many of the sectors have subsectors. So for instance, for recreation, we'll do winter recreation as well as summer recreation. For agriculture, we do crops and we do livestock. And so then we weight those scores, but based on the presence of each of those within the counties, and can come up with an actual score of 1 to 4. So this, as I said, is county level information, and it's all integrated into one number. You can dive into the spreadsheet. So if individual counties want to, or municipalities within those counties or sectors want to know or understand what is driving those scores, they can actually drive into that. And I'll show this in the tool in a second, how that can be accessed really easily. One of the biggest challenges that we face with being kind of on the cutting edge of this vulnerability assessment is a lot of the data and resources we rely on to feed into this are not updated as frequently as we update the drought plan. This was especially true when we were updating the drought plan every 3 years, but is still true on the 5-year cycle. And so sometimes that we're challenged by that, or some data is available for one portion of the state, but not another portion of the state. And we try to be really consistent in our methodology statewide. So that presents a challenge as well. This is what overall agricultural impact vulnerability ranking looks like. This is for the agricultural sector. This is the new one from this year. You can see that probably not all that surprising. Areas of the Eastern Plains where there's a great deal of dryland agriculture has a much higher vulnerability to drought than other areas of the state. One of the things that we added this year that I think is really interesting is we did a county by county analysis on how their vulnerability scores have changed over time. So this is comparing the drought plan from vulnerability assessment from 2013 to 2018. So what we're trying to get at here is, are these communities becoming more vulnerable to drought or less vulnerable to drought? And if they're becoming less vulnerable to drought, why is that? Is it because they're adopting adaptive practices? And if so, are those adaptive practices, do they have scalability to other parts of the state? And can we help other areas of the state implement those as well? If they're becoming more vulnerable, why is it that they're becoming more vulnerable? And what can we do to help those communities so that they are not increasingly more vulnerable to drought? Some of these things are driven by things out of our control, like temperature, and the fact that if you have a hot drought, then some of the indicators that you have going into it, regardless of what your adaptive capacity is, you can't necessarily respond in quite the same level of effectiveness. Okay, so I want to walk you through, and I kind of flew through all of that because I wanted to get to the cool part. Not that the rest of that wasn't cool, but this is more cool. And so I'll pause there for 1 second to see if you have any questions on what I just talked about.
Any questions?
All right. So we try to push the envelope every time we update the drought plan. And this can be challenging because, like I said, we have the most comprehensive plan in the nation right now. And so when you're out in front, sometimes it's lonely and people can't tell you what you can do better. So we wanted to really think about how can we use drought information to make better decisions? And how can we create tools and resources to help folks who have less resources utilize drought resource or drought information into their decision-making process. CWCB has a grant program for developing drought mitigation response plans and implementing those, but they haven't been utilized at quite the level that we would like, in part because it's not mandatory for them. And a lot of these small communities just don't have the staff resources to take on a project like that. But we wanted to these communities to be able to utilize some of the information, the data that we've created, even if they didn't have a full comprehensive drought mitigation and response plan. So we came up with this idea of doing a drought visualization tool and linking some of the data from our vulnerability assessment into a mapping platform, along with some of the other data and indicators that we use, like Palmer, like the Drought Monitor, things of that. And so you could overlay different layers and decide what you wanted. And we wanted it done at a county level because that's pretty much how we do everything. But because it's so different across the state, we felt like that gave us the best spatial representation of how each of the individual counties are represented. So this is a screenshot from this, and we can give folks access to the actual tool if they want to do it. I have limited faith in Wi-Fi, so rather than doing a live demonstration for you guys, we just decided to do this in a PowerPoint so that we knew that it would work. So it's a really cool tool, and like I said, if you're interested in getting access to it, we can show that. We're trying to figure out kind of where this lives, and how we get access to folks who want this information. And so we're going to be working through those logistical pieces here in the next couple of weeks. But this prototype has already been developed and has already actually garnered some attention from the National Drought Mitigation Center as something that they'd possibly like to support. So again, you can do this by the county level. So you can select your county here. And then within that, you can select different components or different pieces of information that you have, and different layers that are on here. So this is just called the County Drought Tracking Dashboard. And so this obviously is not a map. This is just a bunch of pieces of data information that you can get at the county specific level. So you can see your drought, like how your county is represented in the Drought Monitor. You can see how you are month by month for different indices. So this is showing the Palmer Drought Severity Index as well as the Palmer Z. These are two different types of Palmer Index. And how they've kind of operated over the last couple months. And then this pulls in the county drought vulnerability risk score by sector. So you can see which sectors are most at risk or have the highest vulnerability within each of your counties. So then this is really the first time we've had those maps that I showed you of kind of what it looks like for sectors in our drought plan for the last couple of years. And everyone, when we present this, is like, this is super cool. I never knew this existed. And then no one uses it to help in their local decision-making process. And it's because it's a little buried in an 800-page plan and didn't really have a mechanism by which to be shared. And so this was our attempt to try to create that interface that could be quickly utilized from a data standpoint to help people make decisions. So you don't need to have a full drought plan. You just need to kind of say, how are the conditions? Let me pull up my county, and it can spit it out into a map. And so I'm going to walk you through what that map looks like. So obviously this is the state of Colorado, and you can select your different layers that are over here. And these pull in different things. So they could be a drought outlook map. They could be drought fire risk. They could be vegetation and evaporation. So you can decide. There's even some forecasting pieces in here that you can put in here. You can select what to show and what not to show. You can have, you can hover over these the bubbles here and get a drop down of kind of what those conditions are and what it means. And then obviously you can determine whether or not you want to show indicators, whether or not you want to zoom in. And you can put different layers over here. So here we have the U.S. Drought Monitor on here as one of the layers, as well as the state vulnerability assessment layer on here. And so you can kind of layer these maps accordingly to determine, okay, are the areas that have the highest vulnerability in this sector also the areas that are most impacted by drought, or also the areas that have the highest fire risk for this season? So you can kind of layer all of these maps to help make better informed decisions. And one of the things that we're doing right now with the vulnerability assessment is that when you hover over that, it will tell you what your score is for each of the sectors, so you can drive into what sector is driving your overall score. Sometimes that's really obvious. Obviously, on the or most frequently on the Eastern Plains, it's agriculture that's driving that. But there's a lot of counties where it's not necessarily very clear as to what's driving the vulnerability piece. And so having that information at your fingertips is really nice. You don't have to click multiple times to get into something. If you really want to dive into the methodology, that's available. But this is really something that you could spend 15 or 20 minutes on, get a good overview of what's happening in your county, what the forecasts say might be coming, and what the past 6 months have shown, and what the state drought plan says. So what we're doing now with this is trying to solicit feedback from potential users. Is this user-friendly? Is this something that would work for you? Do you like it? How do we make this available in a way that makes sense? We're trying to incorporate more data resource sets. So including some of those subsector scores, like I just said, we're working on that, and possibly linking it to broader products. It was built kind of with the idea that it could be linked up to the national water model. And it didn't really play out that way because of some limitations that existed. But as that model develops more, there might be potential to link those like stream flow forecasts and things like that into this tool as well. We are working with some of our national partners. The National Drought Mitigation Center is really interested in this, and seeing how we can kind of further develop this and then just test it to see if folks can use it going forward. So going back to the drought plan as a whole, I mentioned that this has been, about a 10-month process updating this plan. We did a 30-day public comment period. All of those public comments have been addressed in some way or another within the final version of the plan that you all have seen. Our hope is for you all to approve it today, and then we'll send this to be incorporated into the All Hazards Mitigation Plan, which will go to the governor for approval next month, and then on to FEMA for approval. I also wanted to touch a little bit on kind of current conditions, because why we update this plan is so we can respond to conditions in years like this. And I know I used to do drought updates during times of activation for folks, but we haven't done that this year. And so I just wanted to kind of give a quick overview of how this drought plan has come into actual play in a year like this, when we've seen extreme and severe drought across the state. So this is the U.S. Drought Monitor that came out this morning. And even though we are at the end of the water demand season, we are still seeing expansion of drought within the state of Colorado. The D4 actually expanded northward from southwestern Colorado right here. It expanded northward a little bit. We have seen some trimming and improvements throughout other areas of the state. And in fact, oh, look at that. I was smart enough to put it in. This is the change over 2 months. So the areas where are yellow or orange, we've actually seen a degradation over the last 2 months. The areas that are green, various shades of green, we've seen improvements over the last 2 months. So with this, you can actually see how the monsoon season manifested. You can see that southeastern Colorado benefited the most from the monsoon season. And northwestern Colorado was the one. Northwestern Colorado doesn't typically get a ton of monsoonal moisture anyway, but it was really hot and dry in that area in August and September. Some regions were seeing average temperatures about 5 degrees higher than normal. And so again, that was just really drying out soils and drying out the atmosphere. And so we have been in activation for the drought plan. This is what's to come. I'll get to that in a second. We've been in activation for the drought plan since May 2nd. It was initially activated for 34 counties throughout Colorado, and has recently been expanded to include an additional 6 counties. So we're now activated for 40 counties throughout the state of Colorado. The Drought Task Force has been meeting every 3 weeks since May, as well as the Agricultural Impact Task Force. We did do a drought tour in the Durango area in August. And so we have been in full activation mode as the drought plan lays out that process since May, and we'll continue to go forward with that into the winter months, because we don't necessarily foresee the drought being deactivated in the near future. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we could just expect to see. Again, this is the new map that just came out this morning from the Climate Prediction Center, which is part of NOAA. And you can see that across much of Colorado, the drought is projected to persist through the end of the year. This is actually a big change from last month when this map came out. Last month, they thought that it was going to continue in northwestern Colorado, but that most of southern Colorado was going to see some improvements, but the drought would still persist. So it wasn't going to necessarily get any worse in southwestern Colorado. This is projecting that we are going to persist throughout much of the state through the end of the year. I don't necessarily know what's driving this at this point. Like I said, this just came out this morning, so it's one of the things I'm going to dive into to see kind of what the projection is. The NOAA is still saying there's a 70% chance that we'll shift to an El Nino by the end of the year. Typically, an El Nino in Colorado means that we're wet to the south and dry to the north. But we don't necessarily know where that line falls. And so that was being a bit of concern for northwestern Colorado. But we also don't know how strong the El Nino will be, and that can often influence the amount of precipitation that Colorado will get. Another piece of this that is really driving the drought that we've seen this year that's really different, and it's been really interesting when you talk to folks about, how is this drought different from years past. We've hearing a lot of reports in southwestern Colorado of folks whose wells are running dry, and when you ask them how they were in 2002, they say, "Oh, we were fine in 2002." And what we've seen across much of the state is that this is just a hotter drought, and hotter droughts dry things out more. And what we can see from this is both temperature and precipitation projections for 3 months, is that it's not necessarily the precipitation that's the issue. This is actually showing that we have there's a potential for above average precipitation through the end of the month, or through the end of the year, but that temperatures, when they are also above average, that moisture that falls to the ground is less effective, or you need more moisture to do the same amount when you have higher temperatures. So going back to the drought plan, that lays out our response and how we respond to folks on the ground, how we work with folks, how we communicate. And one of the things we developed in 2012, 2013 was this drought response portal. We do still have this up and going. We haven't been able to, or we haven't utilized it quite as much this year because it's really municipal focused, where you can type in your zip code and find out what your restrictions are based on your zip code. But it is still active. And this widget that we have on our website, that was actually developed by Russ Sands when he was with the city of Boulder, and then we kind of borrowed it. So now we've borrowed him, or taken him. Is still up and running. So this is a really good dashboard for getting, and this is a screenshot that's old, so where that meter isn't really accurate, but it's where you can get the monthly drought update from the Water Availability Task Force that we put out every single month. It's where you can get the latest map for the U.S. Drought Monitor, reservoir storage information, as well as snowpack information. So we try to just make all this information available at the tip of your fingers, so folks can get to it as quickly as possible. So because I talk really, really fast, I think that I just shaved 10 minutes off your day. So you're welcome. But I'll entertain any questions that you have.
Well done. Director Gallagher.
Taryn, I wasn't sure, has this beta version of the portal, the drought monitoring portal, been deployed yet? At this point, is it waiting approval of this
This
plan?
piece or the visualization
The
tool?
visualization
It
tool.
hasn't gone public yet. We need to figure out where it's going to live first,
Right.
and then we'll go public with it. But we're hoping that'll happen pretty soon.
But you mentioned you have a survey out there. You're trying to get some feedback from. Is that like a select group of emergency managers?
It's actually mostly people who are working within the drought realm, so not necessarily the county emergency managers, but folks who have been working on drought response planning.
Okay.
Yeah. So our hope is to kind of deploy this over the next couple months and get it in people's hands so they can start playing with it, and then we can seek additional funding to try to fine tune it.
Yeah, it'd be really good to get that second level, the actually on the ground people who have to deal with it in terms of accessibility and usability.
Yeah, I completely agree. And as soon as we get that, we'll make sure that we let you guys know too, so you can get it out to all of your constituents as well.
Director Goebel.
Thanks, Taryn. I know that NOAA's no farmer's almanac, but do they? That's the Do you know if they look back on their former forecasts and see how accurate those are?
Thank you. It's a great question. They do. And I would say that there are times that they're more accurate than others. They tend to be really accurate on temperature and less accurate on precipitation for Colorado. It's really tricky to forecast precipitation in Colorado, and so that's been one of the challenges that we have. But their skill for temperature is better. Yeah.
Other questions? Director Anderson.
I might make a comment. The operation of Taylor to a certain extent, but certainly the Aspinall unit is all based on the NOAA's Colorado Basin Forecast Center. This year, the forecast just dove off until we were where we're at. I am impressed with their efforts. They take everything possible into consideration. Forecasts of the basin storage of the conditions prior to the winter, soil moisture, the problems that we have with the dust on the snow and forecasting equipment and all. So, but they're still predicting weather, and even though they continue, I think, improve, there's definitely ways to go. It's very important for us because the May 1st forecast on the Gunnison River controls the releases from the Aspinall unit for flows not only through the Gunnison Gorge, but also the lower Gunnison, issue being endangered species.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely accurate. And there was actually a week-long meeting last week that I was unable to attend because I was at a different meeting, but where there was a number of scientists who came together to work on improving the long-term seasonal forecasting within the U.S. The U.S. as a whole, not just Colorado, has really struggled with the accuracy of their long-term seasonal forecasting. For whatever reasons, be it what's driving the weather, Europe has done a lot better with their long-term seasonal forecasting as far as their skill. And so the U.S. is really trying to figure out what do we need to do to improve our skill sets to provide more accurate, skillful forecasts. And so they were talking about it just last week. So hopefully we see some improvements.
We can always rely on the full farm.
Does it say we're going to have a good winter this year? Because that's really what I want to hear.
Absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
you
Good.
did. You wanted me to read it?
I'll go with that.
Either we will or we won't. That's
Right,
that's for darn
exactly.
sure. Yep. All right. Any other? Director Trick.
I will go ahead and make the motion to adopt the staff recommendation on agenda item 26.
Been moved by Director Trick, seconded by Director Anderson, that we approve staff recommendation on agenda item 26. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we shall proceed to vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Taryn. Thank you for talking fast. Agenda item 27, Colorado Water and Growth Dialogue. Kevin.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Kevin Reedy, CWCB staff for the record. And I have with me Matt Mulika from the Keystone Policy Center. So we're going to kind of tag team a little bit on this presentation. And so I mentioned this last board meeting as one of the projects I've been working on for a while with this land use water efficiency intersection. And it's been one of these things that's been going on for quite a long time, we think about 4 years at this point. And it's been kind of a really interesting journey. So we're gonna show you guys some of the results from a final report we're coming out with. Hopefully early next week it'll be published. But I wanted to get in front of you guys just to kind of show you some of the results and show you some of the results out of this, and maybe and kind of just pique your brains a little bit about the impacts that we could be seeing from some of the stuff that we investigated on this. Let me go to the next slide here. Okay, great. And this is agenda item 27, Colorado Water and Growth Dialogue, and this is informational only, so you guys can just kick back and relax and listen. So you don't have to make a decision on anything on this one. Like I said, about 4 years, and it was phased in with fits and starts, and we kind of felt our way along because we were kind of discovering nobody had really done this before, some of the work we were doing. So we had to kind of figure out what we were looking at, what would fit next in the next phase, a few different phases. And Matt's been in this since the beginning as a facilitator. So he's been facilitating this whole process, kind of herding all the cats. But as you see from the outline here, this is just the outline of the presentation. So we've got all the collaborators on this. I'll throw up a couple slides with all the people that were involved. The goals of the project, or a first report that came out that was kind of a fact-finding report. And then we get into quantitative analysis of some density impacts on water demand, and then a tool that was generated out of a lot of this work, and then finally the strategic levers, which is more of a qualitative exploratory scenario planning process that we went through to get this. And thanks to Denver Water for all the efforts, because we had a lot of help from Denver Water, and we used Denver Water and Aurora Water water consumption data for the background of all these analyses that we did on this. So it was really helpful. We had Mitch Horry from their planning department that just did a tremendous job. He created that tool as an Excel sheet. So we'll get in a little bit about that. But as we went through this, in the beginning, we were working with Dr. Kaga as well, too. We wanted to use their urban sim model. And it was just kind of a really instructive phase when we started in this thing, because it was their model did not have anything to do with water. And we were like, well, we can just plug water into this and make it work. And that was one of the first lessons we learned. It was really difficult, and we couldn't do it. And so it was kind of one of the early dawning moments, like, whoa, boy, this might be something we should be talking about a little bit more, and working with Dr. Cog, making sure we can get a water element in their land use planning model. So collaborators, you probably can't read this very well, but we were one of the funders, as well as Denver Water and Gates Family Foundation, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, NSF, and Walton. I was on the steering committee along with a number of other folks. The fourth person down, Ray Quay, he's from Arizona State University. He did the analyses that Matt's going to present coming up in this presentation. Really interesting stuff. We don't think anybody had done it before, and you're going to see some pretty interesting results from that. Technical support, we had a lot of folks there too from ASU, Dr. Cog, Denver Water, the Sonoran Institute, and then I'll cast characters for the working group. and that kind of was a growing and shrinking group over the 4 years as well. So we had a lot of people from a lot of different areas, lending their expertise to this. So it really helped kind of shape this out and really make it a much better process in the end. So you guys know a lot of what's on the slide. We're looking at maybe nearly doubling our population. It's people using water. That's going to be a really big impact. 5 million more people, possibly. And the interesting fact, though, is by 2050, most people will live in buildings that are yet to be built. And so that's a huge opportunity. That's something that we need to kind of look at and say, well, how can we shape this going forward instead of let it happen to us, those kind of things. And again, as you've heard from me before, there was very little integration of land and water planning. So the goals. So we kind of high level goals here, and we just kind of said, well, we don't know if this work or this kind of idea is going to move the needle. Does it, is there an effect on water demand in the future of how we build things and how we go forward? So we wanted to see how much water we could save, integrating these things together, develop a consensus-based recommended strategies out of this thing, but also try to provide local communities with data and tools and those kind of things to help them make their own decisions, because as you'll see with some of this research, it's very locale specific, and if you try to extrapolate it somewhere else, it might not work. So we're using Denver water and Aurora water, water consumption data, and the housing stock here. Well, that's going to look very different in other parts of the state and other parts of the nation. So we wanted to make something useful for folks to address this issue down the road. So the first part was, call it the Clarion Report, at least I do. It's we hired Clarion Associates and Don Elliott. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's like a guru. He's a land use attorney, and he knows everything. It's amazing. This guy knows everything you want to know about this stuff. But what we really want to do is see if there's any kind of studies that link these two things together and go out. A whole lot of stuff happening out there of what we were trying to look at. But from the research that they did and they found, we kind of came up focused a little bit more on 4 recommended land use patterns, and really looking at building smaller single family parcels, changing from single family to multifamily, building denser multifamily, and then enacting landscape restrictions and codes on top of all this, right? So that urban irrigation landscape thing goes hand in hand with these things. So we kind of focused on that as we move forward. And so here's some of the just examples, so you guys can visualize this a little bit. These are all from Denver Water Service area as well. But you see the smaller single family lots, and I think these are under 5,000 square feet. You move up from single family to multifamily, so you've got a little more densification there, and units per acre, basically. And then you get into really higher multifamily density. So these are kind of the visuals that you'll think about when we're talking about this other research here. Of how this could, whether or not this could affect it or not. That was our question. And then turf restrictions. Those are some examples of what that looks like when you've got certain percentages of turf. And I think, if I remember right, the one up on the far left, I think it used like 10 more times turf than the 20% or the no maintained turf, or 10 times more, I think, in the season. And this is all from Denver Water Service area as well. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Matt in a second here, but you can see these are kind of comparisons of what densities we're looking at, right? So you got Denver Water Service area down here, 4,000 people per square mile, and then by 2050, looking at 6,000. So still a lot of people, right? But compared to those other cities, we're still not even close. That's a lot of. You're talking 27,000 people per square mile. That's a ton of people. And actually, I think Lyon, France is. You wouldn't think of it, but that's denser than New York City even. So, so we're not talking about crazy, but still, that's a huge jump. It's a lot, and we'll have to see how that plays out. But that's why we were doing this stuff. How can we affect this outcome? Does it move the needle for water demand reduction? Can we see this change? So, okay, let me turn over to Matt. What's that?
Well, I'm curious. The cities that are on the chart are the densest in America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you look at that though, St. Louis I wouldn't have thought that at all. And Nashville, 1,000 people per square mile. But these are major metropolitan cities, so yeah. But we're ranked up there. It's just a comparison.
Where's LA though? I guess their question.
Oh, you want LA? I'm not sure. I can look it up really quick for you while I'm off.
That's okay. It's just.
Oh no, we don't.
No, you'll be
Let me-
in New York, but you don't live.
Let me be very clear. I'm not advocating that at all.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna hand over to Matt, and he can take you through this. I'll be tag teaming if he needs me. And
Great, thanks, Kevin. So, yeah, not trying to be New York, but just to put this into perspective of what we're talking about, 6,000 is the projected density in 2050, and so this is the research I'm about to present. It comes out of Arizona State University, and that researcher has offered to come out and to present. If there's more questions than I can answer as the facilitator of this group and not the researcher. So as the first thing that the analysis looked at was, well, what is the current housing stock on the Front Range, in the Denver metro area, in Aurora, and to classify those into seven housing types. And so we don't really have classifications of housing types that we could all agree on. So we came up with that. And so we came up with large single family as the least dense, all the way to high density multifamily. And you can see that typical single family, as might be expected, is vastly has the greatest number of homes. And that's the product type that we most see on the Front Range by quite a bit. And so what we did was we looked at, or what Ray did was we looked at, if we were to move to denser environments, how much water could we save? And so there's a modeling exercise where they looked at a 10% shift all the way up to a 50% shift and did 5,000 mile runs per shift. So you can see, so you can go from large single family to typical single family, or you can do larger jumps where you're jumping over housing types. And this is for new development. So as we are taking this next 5 million people, we can have a baseline where they moved into homes as they've done in the last 50 years, or you could have them move into more dense environments. And so this resulted in 25,000 model runs. And then they looked for themes in the data and to pull out, how much could we move the needle? And then, what would it cost? How much of an impact to lifestyle? How much of a cost in terms of infrastructure and also political capital? Moving into a denser environment involves quite a few of these costs. And so one interesting thing is the variability. The blue line on the bottom is your low range of water use, and your red line is your high range of water use. And so the denser you get, the less variability there are between the low water users and the high water users. So a large single family that is really efficient may not use much more than a 3-story walk-up. But some of those people, you can see that top red line, will use a ton of water. And you can imagine, as we're looking at these large single family homes, some of them have sprawling lawns, and then some of them might be more water conscious and use more xeriscape and have low water use plants. And so what we're finding is, and a lot of this is, well, of course you'd find that. This seems like obvious results, but in the past we were saying communities should integrate land and water planning. Well, why should we? How much water can we expect to save? And so that's really what is the point of this analysis, was determine these are the kind of percentages that you can save. So household movements from large single family to traditional single family to other building types is going to provide the biggest bang for your buck. So as you're looking out into the future and you're zoning, if you could take a percentage of the homes 4% water demand reduction under the 10% scenario, all the way up to 8 to almost 19.5% demand reduction. We're talking about almost 20% demand reduction from new growth. That's a huge number. But you're also talking about moving 50% of your housing stock into something that's not large and single family homes. So that's quite an impact to the region, into our quality of life, not to mention the infrastructure costs to do that. And so once again, I think these are results that we could have expected, but ones that are enlightening to communities that may not have a lot of water rights or are looking to do things differently in the future. And so, yeah, kind of reiterating what I just said. So, increasing density may decrease water demand of new growth from 2 to 20%, with the higher resource density costs increase with the higher water savings. So the more you want to put on the line, the more political capital, infrastructure costs, quality of life, and the more water you can expect to save. And lower resource density, cost density increases may achieve 3 to 8%. So still pretty good. So imagine if you just started to use some new urbanism or some higher density and just try to encourage it through incentives. We didn't look at regulations, or it mostly was incentive based and trying to just have the town character. Certainly, town councils and zoning committees can have some say in that. And then we also looked at efficient landscaping, and so this is using your comprehensive plans and your codes to reduce the amount of landscaping that's on the land, requiring or incentivizing low use water plants, and then all the way up to xeriscape. And so you got about a 5 to 25% water demand decrease from doing this. And this was as effective, if not more effective than density. Looking at them together, which is probably the most effective, as we look into the future and we have less water and more people, then you're probably going to have an all of the above approach, where you're going to incentivize people to build communities that use less water outside the home, and also to have denser growth. So we're really replacing grass with people, to make it to put it in a nutshell. So that's great. So we have this information that's kind of, well, of course we understand that, and we do expect that. So we created this tool out of Denver Water that you can take a given number of people and distribute it through the 7 housing types and set their outdoor water efficiency at low, medium, or high. And you can set 3 different examples next to each other and see what the differences are in water demand reduction. So say you have 100,000 people, you put them all into typical single family and large single family, and then on the other side, you put them into high density, and then maybe you have a middle scenario. Scenarios in pie charts and in graphs. So as people are looking at, okay, well, how are we going to distribute these people? We have this demand that's coming in. We know that we're growing as a state. Let's understand what are decisions and what are the trade-offs. You can also take a given amount of land. Say you have 10 acres. You can zone those 10 acres for large single families or typical single families, and you can play with those zoning, and you can see what the water use implications for those decisions are. And so we really see this as a way for land planners and water planners to be able to run some scenarios themselves, and then be able to present those results to council, so they can say, this is how we think we should grow, and here's some data behind it. And as Kevin said, and as that graph showed, there's a lot of variability, and this was just for Denver Water and Aurora Water customer data. And so it may not be, the exact acre feet that you could expect, but it can show you the percent changes and give you some broad brush strokes. It's not meant to be, a total predictive tool, but just to show the deltas of the water use. So you can really see it somewhere between 10 and 20 units per acre. The law of diminishing. You have a lot of water savings. This was 200,000 parcels with 400,000 units on there. And this is all based on outdoor water use. And so indoor water use, for the most part, was maintained. You imagine that even if a person, whether they're living in a high-rise or a large single-family home, will wash the same amount of dishes, use the same amount of indoor use, take the same amount of showers. And so this analysis was underpinned by outdoor water use and impervious area. I'm going to hand it back over to Kevin, but before I do, is there any questions on this density analysis that we conducted?
All right. Thanks, Matt. Any questions from Matt? All right. Welcome back, Kevin.
All right. Thank you. Kevin Reedy, CWCB staff for the record. Sense, but will that create more sprawl or less in sprawl, or what, and so again, like scenario planning, there's a lot of what ifs out there, and you just kind of throw a lot of stuff at the wall and you figure out how it goes. So we went through this whole process and for a couple of days and kind of came out with some major themes that I'll go through. And again, some of these are like, oh, well, duh, of course this came out of that, but you don't know this until you actually go through it and do it. And so so some of the recommended strategic levers, and we call them strategic levers because they're like, what needs to be put in place so we could kind of move the direction of somewhere. What would have the most effect? So of course, encourage the consideration of higher residential densities as a mean to reduce water demand. And so, as you just saw with some of that research, yes, there is something there. A lot of assumptions and caveats in that, but we think that there's something there that can be explored, and we should be looking, and we're talking about water demand, we probably should be looking at more compact development. And since we are having so many new houses coming online in the next 40, 50 years, it would be, we need to look at this stuff and see how that works into it. Adopting landscaping policies to lower future water demand from population growth, another one, right? We've got a lot of landscaping code now in the books, but we think that we can do more with that. And also, there's a little more of a synergistic effect with the compact development and these landscaping policies. As a slide that Matt had up there, I think it was a 5 to 15% reduction with pretty low resource costs. So it would be a lower hanging fruit to go after if you combine these things too. Of course, we've still got human behavior running those irrigation systems, so that's something that we should look at as well. The incorporating a one water approach into planning. Now, we didn't really. It came up in this exploratory scenario planning process, but it wasn't really so much. We didn't explore it too much in the research, the final report as much. But it's something that's been coming up a lot more in terms of, okay, well, sure, we're talking about water efficiency. What about stormwater? What about green space? What about all these things? What about transportation? What about infrastructure for water as well? And how does that work into it? And so when you're looking at a one water approach, you're really looking at all these water sources and looking together in a more integrated fashion. And I was just out at Kansas City last week presenting at an inaugural Water Planning Connect conference put on by the American Planning Association in AWWA, and got to talk about our water plan. And State of Connecticut really needs to talk to us because she came up to panic because they're in trouble with theirs. They can't get anything done. But we talked about what state water plans and land use planning together. But we also had a meeting after the conference at the a couple hour meeting just to get the people who are doing research. And one water was a very large topic in that meeting, and so it was researchers and funders and people from all over the nation. We sat down for a couple hours and traded what we were doing and what we thought we wanted to do. But one water rose to it, and I think it's a really important thing to talk about because as we densify, we certainly don't want a concrete jungle. We still need green space. We still need stormwater and green infrastructure to handle this water, but also we're gonna have a lot more people. So it's this balancing act. And I think that's one of the examples that we could use, and it would help us manage this better. Of course, it's easy to say, it's easier to see on paper, to say, yeah, let's just do a one water approach, but we've got our own silos within the water industry as well, so we're trying to break those down as well. Incorporate aspects of water planning into long range planning. So yeah, that's a no. That's okay. Yeah, of course we should do this, but I've said this before. I think the only required element in a comprehensive plan in the state of Colorado is a tourism element. There's nothing that's required about water or natural resources or anything like that. And so what the idea is, and a lot of the other trainings I've talked to you guys about before, are really about integrating these things together, more solidly. And one of those places is the comprehensive plan, because it's vision for that community. And if we can get it there, we can get it into other parts of the zoning and building codes and those kind of things too, much easier. At least it's there. We can say, hey, it's in the comprehensive plan. How do we make this happen in reality? So just kind of restating some of the obvious things there, but it's important to keep talking about this because it's still not happening at a higher level. And share success stories and case studies. So again, this was more of a qualitative thing, but like I did last week in Kansas City, it was great. I got to hear from people from all over the states doing this work. Really smart PhD people from like Stanford and stuff were there too. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. But they're doing a lot of really interesting stuff now. But again, it's this sharing of stories and kind of case studies, and also getting that word out to our local governments and water planners, and saying, hey, did you know that this community X is doing this? Would this fit for your situation? So that was one of the major themes that came out of that. Develop, track, and refine new metrics that link water use to land use. And again, it's doing that kind of research that Matt just presented on. It's doing the work that is going to be coming up in this grant in November about actually assigning metrics to these land use patterns and these land use types, and saying, okay, this is what we can expect from this. And then quite possibly, looking at new developments and saying, well, this is kind of the water budget for this kind of development or this kind of commercial enterprise would be about, here, somewhere between these two ranges. And so it helps the water planning go forward much easier, and knowing what your land use types, what kind of impacts you're going to have on the water situation. Encourage water smart development through suite of local development standards and incentives. Like Matt was saying, we're such a local control state, but we work a lot with incentives. And so looking at these things where you can have density bonuses or, reduced tap fees on the water side or things like that. That's, kind of developing more best practices around those things and getting a suite of those development tools, a little more researched and a little more fleshed out for folks to access. And then for the last one, is just kind of it was brought up by a number of people in there, so we kept it in. Water smart design guidelines for government-owned buildings. So if you're doing your part and you're living in your community, but your city hall is overwatering or whatever, broken sprinklers, and you're like, well, why am I doing my part? So it's kind of like getting your own house in order, but also kind of looking at that and saying, how do we do that with government-owned buildings, public rights of ways, the tree lawns as we've got them in Denver, where you've got a little, grass that probably shouldn't be there. Nobody's going to play soccer on it. So, how does these land use patterns affect this, and how do we grow these cities and the new stuff? And we go there. So.
I'll let you finish.
Okay, thanks. So I think that's all I've got for this report. So, and by the way, LA has 7,544 people per square mile. So 7,544 for LA. Yep. So I think that's it. That's so I'm sure you guys might have a lot of questions. If as Matt said to Ray Quay, who's from Arizona State, he said he couldn't make it up, but he's like, maybe if I'm up in Denver another time along, at a time where your board meeting is meeting, I could always go more in depth on this stuff, because we try to do it justice, but there's a lot in there and it's very complicated research, but it was a really good first stab at it, I think, and it's really kind of gave us something to put a hat on. So any questions?
All right. For what it's worth, you look like you could be a professor from Stanford. So.
Thank you. Yes. I'm not wearing my bow tie, though, so I don't know.
Director George.
I don't have a question. I want to commend you. I've been kind of wrestling with this land use planning versus water planning versus local government versus freedom of choice for all of my career. And this is the first time I see anybody with an idea that could actually help us. It's got lots of good parts to it. The first one being that it doesn't immediately cause a political knee-jerk reaction. It lets you get a little farther into it. And of course, because it's a drought period and because water is the planning tool that you're using to get to the land use decision making, I think it's got enormous value. I really like it.
Thank you.
So keep it up.
Yeah, a lot of people did a lot of good work on this. So it's a big team effort. But yeah, we're continuing this. We've got our Land Use Water Alliance Planning Alliance now that is coming out of this group, and we're really having a lot of people meeting every couple months to go over who's doing what, all the work that's going on around the state and the nation too. So thanks.
Director Wells, I think.
Well, Kevin's heard this from me before, but one of the problems, I don't mind all the data. I think it's very helpful. If you have no landscape, you use less water. That's sort of the bottom line. But you ruin the quality of life. I mean, that was mentioned a couple of times. But I was thinking the veterans on the board may have received little paper I did on the value of urban landscape in 2014. CSU's done one in 2017, and I will send it to Andrew and Viola maybe to send around to you all. The problem that I have with the particular notion is less water used outdoors is better, period. That's not true. It is in many instances worse because landscape, reasonable, not overwatered, in fact, provides enormous value to the air, to the water, to mental health, to value of property, on, and it's quantifiable, and it's a lot of money. And CSU's study says that in Colorado, 3% of consumptive use is for all outdoor uses that aren't agricultural. Parks, playgrounds, lawns, houses, golf courses. So that's 3%. So if we tackle that 3% and have that god-awful thing on the right-hand side with the no turf picture, we will have harmed ourselves. And so, it is because it's so easy to say, you people, if you just had no lawns, we'd be fine. It's really not true. And so I don't know how that gets taken into account. I guess I don't have a problem with the idea of assigning scores to water use, but somehow the same conversation needs to say, if you go too far, you ruin a lot of stuff, including water quality and air quality. And for example, you can save an enormous cost of air conditioning if you have trees in your lawn, trees around your house. So they're all, it's just not a yes, no. And sometimes we in the water world do that.
Yep.
Less water is good no matter what. And that's really not true. It's not true for agriculture, and it's not true for landscape. So just my little sermon.
I agree
I'm
with
a voice in the wilderness, but I'm going to keep on.
No, I agree with that. That's really good. And so that was one of the things that actually Mark Waggy was working on this for a long time until he retired. And you know, and he always created that backstop. And it was really good to hear that, because he's like, we don't want concrete jungles, and we definitely don't want that, and we can't have that because it just won't work, right? And we need trees, we need landscaping. And you know, good quality landscaping, because it has an immense value for that. But you know, just an anecdote for myself, my own home, I took out my tree lawn 18 years ago. It was grass and a tree. Put in a lot of other xeriscape. I don't have to mow it. I don't have to hardly weed it. I have to hardly water it, and it looks really nice. So I mean, that's the thing but that's what we're going after, somewhere in the middle. We don't want to go too far, because as some of the research showed, that you know, the resource cost is too high for that, you know, and you know, it's political or social or you know, ecological even. So no, I agree with you 100%. That's exactly not this, and I think we do talk about that in the report a little bit more. You know, maintain the quality of life. How do we balance this act? How do we go forward with this, and how do we maintain quality of life? It might be a different quality of life than we are experiencing now. I know our tree canopy in, for example, Denver is going to look very different, you know, from today, 40 years from now. Very different species, everything else. It's going to have to change. So when those trees die out from old age, they will. We're going to replace them with different species. So it's just things. We're going to see a lot of changes, but we got to be very careful with those changes. I agree with you 100% there.
Any other questions? The other thing to keep in mind is that the bluegrass is kind of used as a reservoir in drought times. So, you know, it's a lot easier to just go in and not water your lawns and conserve water that way. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that, you know, you don't have that reservoir availability for your municipality.
You know what's interesting about that? I've got a little 300 square foot bluegrass reservoir in my backyard, and it's like I didn't hardly water it. But the interesting thing is, if you think about it this way, with different types of landscaping, and you're right, that is a buffer for sure. But if your starting point is let's just say the 16 to 18 gallons per square foot for bluegrass, and you can not water it during the summer, hottest time of the summer, and roost it down, maybe get down to like 10 to 12 gallons per square foot. So you're saving that 6 to 8 gallons per square foot for that season. But with a healthy xeriscape, your starting point is actually lower than that 16 to 18 gallons per square foot, but you've got a capacity to go down even further down from that. So there is resilience there in that kind of landscaping as well. But again, there's certainly, I'm certainly not anti-bluegrass at all. I think we need it for a lot of places. But just so you know that there is a lot of capacity for resiliency in that healthy xeriscape. That just, you have a lower starting point for your gallons per square foot, and you can go lower than grass can without killing it too. So, but yeah, that's exactly, we've got to balance all these ideas for sure.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks
so
Matt.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for coming. And we'll continue on with agenda item 28. Alternative Transfer Method Grant Program. Alex.
Good afternoon, members of the board. I also have Tracy Kosloff here today, too, from the Division of Water Resources. Can also answer questions, since this is a fairly technical ATM grant application. So this is an action item, and staff is recommending approval for this ATM grant. The purpose of this grant would be to facilitate additional flexibility in the HB 13-1248 lease fallow pilot project process and encourage the development of additional pilot projects. For those of the board that aren't familiar with the pilot program, HB 13 1248 authorizes the creation of a lease fallow pilot program to test the usefulness of fallowing and leasing as an alternative to permanent buy and dry. Under this program, CWCB, in consultation with DWR, has developed criteria and guidelines for the application selection and approval of these pilot projects. So after they are applied, this board does have the final say in those pilots. These pilots have helped the state basically identify ways to better facilitate the operations and administration of lease fallowing projects across the state, and future ATM projects as well. So starting in the weeds a little bit with lease fallowing, basically these criteria and guidelines require the applicants to use a lease fallowing tool in preparing their application. This tool provides an accepted common technical platform for calculating water available for lease and to determine return flows owed to avoid injury to other water right holders, thus reducing transaction costs in preparing this ATM application. These guidelines require certain methodologies to be used in that lease fallowing tool in order to provide a conservative analysis of consumptive use. Currently, the fallowing tool requires a seasonal irrigation efficiency of 55% and uses the modified Blaney-Criddle equation to determine consumptive use. The modified Blaney-Criddle method is pretty commonplace here in Colorado. It's been used by the state to determine consumptive use and was selected for this lease fallow tool, because it requires minimal data requirements, basically monthly temperature and daylight hours. And we've also historically in Colorado lacked the extended climate data needed for other alternative methods for assessing consumptive use. At the January board meeting, this board heard testimony that the continued use of the modified Blaney-Criddle equation in the lease fallow tool may not be conducive for all pilot project applications, largely because in high elevation environments, Blaney-Criddle underestimates crop ET and requires an elevation adjustment of about 10% for every 1,000 meters. This is in part to compensate for the fact that there are huge temperature swings as you go up in elevation that this equation doesn't necessarily pick up on using that mean monthly temperature. At that same meeting, the board stated that it was receptive to looking at modifying the existing criteria and guidelines to add a new alternative method for determining consumptive use so that pilot projects at higher elevations may obtain a fair historical consumptive use quantification and to further the goals of the pilot program. DWR has convened a technical committee and they've identified a acceptable streamlined method, which has different names, but basically it's the A standardized reference evapotranspiration equation, or Penman-Teith, I think is how it's else formerly or known as. And long story short, the data requirements for this different method are more detailed. It looks more at daily temperature and daily solar radiation and wind speeds. And with the advance of climate data stations across the state through like COAGMET and other things, we've been able to actually get this data, albeit only back to the early 1990s. So what DWR has done is they've built basically simulated that climate and evaporative data to extend that model back a little bit further so we can use that in this lease fallow tool. But given the complexity of this new equation and all the data required and the different regional differences across the state, DWR is looking to use ATM grant funding to hire a consultant to basically conduct a weather data quality control and integrity assessment to help ensure that this data provides an accurate determination of consumptive use to avoid injury in developing water sharing agreements that work for multiple stakeholders. Staff recommends board approval of this grant to help further the stated goals of Colorado's water plan to facilitate the development and implementation of alternatives to permanent buy and dry, a new streamlined, more accurate method for calculating crop consumptive use could help facilitate further pilot project development and further the state legislative goals of the fallow lease pilot program, including providing CWCB with sufficient data to evaluate the effectiveness of such a streamlined approach. Furthermore, I think providing this option to producers would potentially encourage those that have been hesitant to enroll in the program, given that difference in ET, with a more accurate tool for projecting that. And so with that, I'll also still be here to answer any questions the board may have, but also bring up Tracy to answer any technical questions on what's going on through this process of updating the lease fallow tool.
Welcome, Tracy. Did you want to say anything first, or are you just here to answer questions? State your name.
If it's okay with, this is Tracy Kozloff from the State Engineer's Office. If it's okay with you, I'd like to say a few words.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think Alex gave a really good summary of what the project is that we're proposing to do, but I'll just add a couple words if I can. I'd like to ask for your support with this grant application to further the General Assembly's stated goals for House Bill 1248 pilot projects and to encourage additional alternative transfer methods in the state of Colorado. I think as Alex explained, this project, in terms of validating the climate data that's been simulated already by the Division of Water Resources, when we hire some consultants to review the way that we've applied some methods to simulate climate data, we think this will give water users some confidence in a second streamlined method that we're hoping to add to the criteria and guidelines for House Bill 1248 pilot projects. It will give water users confidence that the results of the second streamlined method are accurate and also conservative, so that they would prevent so these projects would prevent injury to other water users. The ASC method is known to be very accurate, and so what we would like to do for this second streamlined method is build in some additional conservatism on top of the historic consumptive use that's calculated through this method. And we'd like to make it similarly conservative to the method that's already in the criteria and guidelines. So that way, water users who are looking at applications for pilot projects within their divisions can feel comfortable that they're not going to be injured by these projects operating. And also I'd like to add that the QA/QC and validation of the climate data simulation would also help to reduce the engineering costs that people reviewing applications for pilot projects would need to put out in order to review applications for pilot projects. And that's because this project is building in this QA/QC of the climate data. So that's something that water users who are hiring consultants to review applications, that's a piece of data that they're not going to have to review. So we think that if we put this second streamlined method in place, the level of effort to review these pilot project applications will be similar to what there is for the current streamlined method in the criteria and guidelines. So I'd just like to wrap up my request for your support for this grant application. I think that this project will help us build on the success that we already have in the Lower Arkansas River with one lease fallow pilot project that's underway, and hopefully open the doors for some additional pilot projects within the state under House Bill 1248. And
all right.
I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Tracy. Any questions? Dr. Gallagher.
I'm still a little confused as to whether we're talking about a review of data coming in from deployed lysimeters or whether we're just going to do a paper survey. What is the shape of this thing on the ground?
Yeah, so to answer that question.
One streamline, you're going to process, you're going to be doing something else instead of doing what you were doing in the past. Or are you verifying what's on the ground, what you're using in different parts of the state? I still don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah, if I could answer that question. So right now, the criterion guidelines includes one method to calculate historic consumptive use from a farm to then put that water into a lease fallow project where they can lease that water to another water user. So the current method is modified Blaney-Criddle method. And then due to the issues with that method at higher elevations, we're recommending adding a second method to calculate historic consumptive use into the criterion guidelines. That second method would be based on ASC's standard equation. That equation requires a lot of climate data, a lot of inputs that the modified Blaney-Criddle method does not consider. We have a lot of this climate data back about 20 years across the state of Colorado because climate stations were added in the 1990s. Some have been added much more recently. And we'd like to do the analysis for at least a 30-year period. So we don't have the data going back that far. And so DWR has simulated climate data back to 1950 for climate stations across the state. And that was done using methods that are published in the literature. So what this project is to validate that we've appropriately applied those published methods to simulate climate data. That's the first part. And then the second part is to QA/QC that data and just make sure that the calculations all work correctly. And with that, we feel we could update the criterion guidelines, update the streamlined tool that's used to do the historic consumptive use analysis for these pilot projects, and then have a method that works across the state. Sure.
Any other questions? I just wanted to say, I always approach this cautiously on the South Platte, so you probably expected me to say something. But originally in January, when Peter Nichols came and talked to us about this, he was talking about, you're doing the Catlin project so you have one pilot project, is that correct?
There's one project under this bill.
Okay. And so you have that in the Arkansas, and then he had a client in the Rio Grande, I believe he was talking about, that wanted maybe to use something, and it was at a higher elevation. And now I see, and we're not going to look at the Ark or the Rio Grande in this. It excludes the Arkansas and the Rio Grande, and that's because in Arkansas, I think the DSS or whatever is going to fulfill that, or am I mixing things up here? Or is that correct?
No, you're pretty close, if I could add.
Yeah.
So the Arkansas DSS project is currently ongoing to develop the decision support system for the Arkansas River Basin. Part of that is a basin-wide model. The basin-wide model has a historic consumptive use component, and the approach that it's using is the same method we're talking here, simulated climate data, ASC standardized. And so the budget for ArcDSS includes this validation QA piece in that budget. So that's why it's not part of this grant. And then in the Rio, the second streamlined method has a carve out for the Rio Grande. It would still have a second streamlined method, but what we're currently recommending is to use the Rio Grande DSS model, which is currently part of, well, I'll leave that alone. The model for the Arkansas River Basin, it's based on a different approach, the modified Hargreaves equation. And it currently works, well, it works very well for the limited elevation where irrigation occurs in the Rio Grande, which is only like 7,500 feet to 9,000. So it's a narrow band. So again, yes, the Rio Grande is cut out of this because we recommend using the existing model. So I'm sorry if I could be super clear. Okay. A second streamlined method would include using that model in the Rio Grande, which can't currently be used under the current criterion guidelines. So we'd be covering the whole state.
Okay. Just wanted to make that clear. And then I realize this is a pilot, and I'm all for the best available information, but especially on the Platte, Lower South Platte. Well, actually, from Denver, it depends on where you live on the Platte, what you call lower. I call Julesburg lower. So anyway, Brighton, yeah. So we have a group of water users called the Water Rights Association of the South Platte, and it's 240,000 irrigated acres and 1,150 well users, and Fort Morgan and Sterling are all part of it. And so we discuss these things from time to time, and we've always had concern over this streamlined historic consumptive use, and that's just because even though you might have good weather data and everything, each ditch system is a little bit different based on, you know, how much water they can use, and so you have to look at that as well. So I'm not opposed to good information, but each ditch system is unique. I mean, just in Sterling, you know, you have ditch systems that are completely different. So you have to take those kind of things into account. So streamlining them can be difficult. And so, you know, and we've heard that this streamlined method is conservative, and it may be. I guess we've never seen that proven to us, and it may be, and that could be. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. So if you're really conservative, you're protecting other water rights, but then you're holding back 10% of your water that you could have leased out. And so as farmers, they don't necessarily want to lease their water out and hold it back if they have to keep 10% extra in the river. So there's kind of, and the other thing is if we have to give up that 10%, if we have to go into water court for a permanent thing, then if the state has already come up with this model and it's streamlined, and we go into water court and we show that we actually are more efficient, or we have a higher consumptive use or whatever, we have to almost explain, well, why can't you just use the state's information? And it's almost like we have to prove, the bar is raised for us. So we have to prove, why can't we just use this streamlined method and prove to us why that's not good enough for you? So those are some of the issues that we're always concerned about with this. And I guess I'm not opposed to better information in this, but those are the concerns that go through us. And one of the things is, we've never felt that this historical consumptive use analysis is what's limiting the projects for ATMs. It's mostly infrastructure. We don't have a place to put the water to take it to a municipality. The only reason North Sterling has 2 ATMs right now is because of our location. It's nothing else. And, you know, we took the water through water court, and we did that because it worked in our area. So we just don't, and that's one of the things that we're looking at. And maybe, you know, some of this, I like to keep an open mind on all this kind of stuff. So maybe, you know, some of this could be used at some point. And you know, we're looking at this South Platte regional idea. And so if we have infrastructure in place, some of these things could become helpful. I don't know, but that's just one of those things where I just want to be very cautious when we do this, because there's ramifications that sometimes we don't think of when we go forward. So that's all I wanted to say. So thanks for coming. Is there any other question? Director Goebel.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I guess just from the Arkansas Basin's perspective, having actually this project in our basin and our district actually manages it, and we were kind of the outfit that pushed this bill from the start, so I've got a little background on it. But we're a little unique in the Arkansas because we have this HI model, which is the model that Colorado and Kansas agreed to. And so we have factors, you know, seepage rates and all kinds of different factors for each ditch. So we kind of have, in some ways, it's an advantage because we've got these guidelines that we already have to kind of follow. In court, they kind of, you know, sway a little bit, but that's kind of the starting place. And the reason that conservativeness is there is because you are avoiding water court, and you're not running that gauntlet. And so you want to have that water left in the system. And how we've overcome that is, and that's been a concern for farmers, is, well, I don't want to give up that 10% or 15 or whatever it is. But they end up agreeing to it when they see how much they're getting paid, because we've averaged about $1,000 an acre over those 4 years we've run the project, and that's really good for these guys. And so if that market is there, then it all works out. And we have the advantage of storage, and we've so far had pretty good exchange capacity and stuff, so it's worked out well for us. But that's just a little perspective from our end of it. So basins are a little bit different, but it seemed to work out okay for us.
Thanks, Director Noble. Any other questions?
Would you mind if I just add one thing?
You go ahead, yes.
Okay. I really appreciated your comments, and I understand the concerns about your water users, and I think everything about water court is scary to probably all of us who are involved in it. And so thinking about disrupting the way that works it can definitely be scary. But the language of House Bill 1248 was actually directed the streamlined method and the evaluation, doing this process to evaluate how well a streamlined method can work. And I think that Peter Nichols was pointing out to us in January that the method we have in place right now, the streamlined method, doesn't work for everybody. So, I see this as furthering the goal, the intent of the legislature to evaluate a streamlined method. And since the first one didn't work well for everybody, maybe another approach will work better.
Thank you for that explanation. Right. Any other comments? You have a staff recommendation that you want to read, or do we?
Yeah, hold on a second. So, yeah, well, the staff recommendation is approval of the grant.
Oh, yeah. It's not too hard.
Yeah.
So we have a staff recommendation. It's been moved by Director Randall, seconded by Director Goebel, that we approve staff recommendation on agenda item 28. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we shall proceed to vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Move on to agenda item 29, Deep Creek Stakeholder Group Update. Linda.
Me?
Director George.
Oh, my fault. Good afternoon, Linda Bassey with the Stream and Lake Protection Section. Agenda item 29, Deep Creek Stakeholder Group Update, is an informational item with no board action required. It's been a while since we talked to the board about this group, and Director Gallagher reminded me we have some new board members who aren't familiar with this process. So I just wanted to bring you all up to date and give a little basic information for those who haven't heard about it before. In 2015, the Forest Service and BLM issued records of decision finding 3 reaches of Deep Creek suitable for wild and scenic designation. During the public comment period for the EIS related to that, there was no opposition to that finding received, to a finding of suitability or which could lead to wild and scenic designation. The reaches cover about 15 miles, and a little less than 11 of that is on Forest Service land, and the remainder is through BLM land. And in 2016, the Deep Creek Stakeholder Group formed, and that group formed to explore and work on a potential designation of Deep Creek as wild and scenic. A state can ask for such a designation, kind of unusual in Colorado, but This work has been going on, and the group is working on consensus legislative language to designate Deep Creek as wild and scenic. We've got a map here that shows the reach. It's from Hart Lake down to the confluence of the Colorado River. The blue stripes are Forest Service land. There's a little bit of private land right down at the end and right here. And then the brown is BLM land. As you know, when they're looking at a creek or a river corridor for wild and scenic, the federal agencies identify outstanding remarkable values. There are 3 on these reaches: ecologic, scenic, and geologic. The ecologic, this is a rare example of an ecologically intact lower elevation watershed. It's a very pristine canyon landscape and pretty exceptional in Colorado. There are also significant riparian communities with several state and globally rare species, both the species and the assemblages of those species. And there are 2 rare bat species. There are a lot of caves in this corridor, and there are 2 rare bat species that inhabit these caves, and that have good habitat there. The scenic, the Deep Creek descends nearly 4,300 feet, which is over 14 miles. It's a pretty spectacular canyon. The highest point is at over 10,000 feet at Deep Lake. And at the confluence of the Colorado, it's a little over 6,000 foot elevation. So there are, these aren't exactly my words. These are some excerpts from a report, but stunning cliffs and slopes form the walls of the canyon, and you can see them from the Deep Creek overlook and many other vantage points. The geologic ORVs consist of, it's called a karst area, which means water is flowing through limestone, and that has formed these caves in the canyon. And the canyon's carved through many sedimentary formations. There are fossils, and there are 40 known caves in the canyon, one of the highest concentration of caves in Colorado, with several listed as significant under federal designation. So here is a view from the Deep Creek overlook. Back in 2016, the board members went on a tour of this. Some of you were on it. Director George was on it. There was a long, bumpy drive up a dirt road, very beautiful place. And everyone really was pretty thrilled with it, although this picture doesn't seem to indicate that. Everyone looks kind of sad. I was going back through my pictures and I said, well, this is kind of funny. But really, people were more excited about it than this picture.
I was excited. I was over on the other side. It's fine.
So the stakeholder group doesn't meet as frequently as some of the other stakeholder groups that we work with. But they have been meeting regularly, and staff's been participating in that. It's a pretty diverse stakeholder group. The most recent meeting was just this past August. The River District is a member of this stakeholder group and supports the work that it's doing. Local governments, including counties and the towns in the area. Cavers, there's some pretty interesting people. The cavers are kind of characters, very interested. They really care about these caves, and they're interested in not having a lot of publicity surrounding them because they want them to be protected. Climbers, landowners, racers, so a lot of users of the resources along this corridor. Conservation groups, including American Rivers. American Rivers and the Eagle River Watershed Council have been organizing these meetings and facilitating the group. HATS, the high altitude ANR, I like what an acronym is. The high altitude, it's Army National Guard aviation training site. They do helicopter overflights in the canyon. It's a rare opportunity to train Army pilots to be able to land on pinnacles, and so they want to be able to continue this valuable training. so that they have been part of the group and they're supportive of the work as long as they are able to continue with training that they do in this area. And then there are some other interested individuals who are participating. Participants that are acting in more of an advisory capacity include CWCB staff, CPW, BLM, Forest Service, and we have had congressional delegation staff from all of Colorado's congressional delegation. They're very interested in this. They appear to be willing to work on this legislation. So it's been a pretty constructive, positive process. So the group has developed guiding principles, which I've attached to the memo, to guide the drafting of the legislation. And the legislation would designate Deep Creek as wild and scenic, excuse me. So the guiding principles, there's been a lot of group wordsmithing, and I think they're finally at a place where we're calling them final. They recognize the importance of maintaining the values of Deep Creek and they identify the values while respecting private property rights and allowing those current access and uses of the creek and corridor to continue. Right now, the participants are circulating the guiding principles. I've provided them to the board for any input you might have. They're bringing them to their respective organizations for review and comment. And they're working on forming subcommittees to work on drafting, to help with drafting legislative language, education and outreach. And they're also working on an in-stream flow recommendation. We already have an in-stream flow on Deep Creek for 8 CFS in the winter and 14 CFS in the summer. This recommendation that they're working on would be for an increase to that existing in-stream flow water right. And the legislation would include the concept of an in-stream flow water right on Deep Creek as opposed to any federal reserved water right that can come along with a wild and scenic designation. And water right would be intended to protect and preserve the ORVs that I've described. So it would be similar to the language in the Dominguez Canyons legislation where the state was delegated to appropriate and adjudicate a water right to protect the values that were being identified in the legislation. American Rivers is working on developing this in-stream flow recommendation and hopes to bring it to the 2019 in-stream flow workshop. And BLM and CWCB staff have met with them to discuss what type of data collection is necessary and to help them formulate this recommendation. American Rivers has hired Wright water engineers to assist with the data collection, and it's going on right now. And I'll remind you that the board is not funding this effort. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Fund is just for groups who are seeking alternatives to wild and scenic designation. So they are finding funding elsewhere. So with that, I just wanted to let you know what was going on and see if you had any questions or comments about it. And we will continue to work with the group and keep you updated.
Thank you, Linda. Any questions? All right. Thank you very much. We'll continue on agenda item 30. Linda is up again. Colorado River Water Conservation District lease of Rudeye Reservoir water for in-stream flow use. Additional locations of use.
Linda Bassey, Stream and Lake Protection Section. Agenda item 30, I'll start off by saying this is an informational item with no action required. At the July meeting, you all approved a lease of 3,500 acre-feet of Rudeye water from the River District to supplement winter flows in the Frying Pan River. Because the use of that leased water will only occur under specified flow and temperature conditions, and it can only occur from January 1st to March 31st, it's possible we might not use that full 3,500 acre-feet. And the district's lease terms under its marketing policy require any lessee to pay for the full amount of water regardless of the amount used. And we talked about that at the meeting, and there some concerns were expressed. So since July, we've worked with the district to see if there are any other uses that could be made of that water, since we're paying for it anyway. And so what we've landed on is using any remaining leased water after March 31st for release and use in the 15-mile reach of the Colorado River. And we would coordinate with the district, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Bureau of Reclamation on the timing and rate of releases for this use. So I think you all know the lay of the land, but here's Rudai, Frying Pan, and here's the 15-mile reach. So it's a fur piece. But we've done it before. This is very similar to the Ute Water Conservancy District lease of water. So although you've already approved this acquisition and you've approved the lease, because we are adding a new location of use and a new time period of use, we thought it would be best to use our Rule 6 process and do a 2-meeting process to ensure that there's adequate notice and opportunity for comment on this additional proposal. The board's first look is today. Within 20 days, anyone can request a hearing on this proposal. And if none is requested, then the board can take final action at the November meeting. Staff's requested recommendations from BLM, CPW, and Forest Service, and provided notice to our in-stream flow subscription mailing list and the substitute water supply plan notification list. The water proposed for the lease is any water remaining. In the memo, I've called it remaining leased water because we've got 3,500. We'll see how much we use between January 1st and March 31st. So then any water that remains available after March 31st would be used for this new purpose. And the source of the leased water would switch to under a different Bureau of Reclamation contract, because the contract that we're using the water for winter use on the Frying Pan allows that use, but doesn't allow that use and 15-mile reach use in the same year. So this river district holds more than one contract with the Bureau of Reclamation for water in Rudai, and so we would use water from a separate contract that does include used water by piscatorial users to supplement stream flow. It's the same identical language that in the Ute Water Conservancy District contract that we're using for our lease of Rudai water. The decreed uses of Rudai Reservoir include piscatorial. So we could use the remaining leased water from April 1st to December 31st to preserve or improve the natural environment on 15-mile reach of the Colorado River. We have 2 decreed in-stream flow water rights on the 15-mile reach. The natural environment of the 15-mile reach provides critical habitat for the 4 species of endangered fish, both spawning habitat and high-quality habitat for adult fish. So the proposed use of the leased water from July 1st to September 30th, the board could use this leased water to supplement existing in-stream flows in the 15-mile reach to preserve the natural environment. And those are set forth below: 581 CFS from July 1st to September 30th, and that's for the full 15-mile reach. And then for the lower 2 miles of the 15-mile reach, an additional 300 CFS. Use it to supplement those if needed, or to go above those and to help meet or reduce shortfalls to the Fish and Wildlife Service flow recommendations for that critical habitat. So use of water above the decreed rates would be improving the natural environment. From April 1st to September 30th, it's a little different. We do not have a decreed in-stream flow on the 15-mile reach during that time period. So the delivery and use of that leased water would be an incremental step toward flows appropriate to preserve the natural environment to a reasonable degree, and would help meet or reduce shortfalls to those flow recommendations. There can be shortages in the spring and late summer. There's a condition referred to as the April hole, where there can be large large shortages sounds like an oxymoron. Severe shortages. Here's a picture from 2013 where it was down as low as 51 CFS. And it doesn't occur every year, but it occurs in some years due to a combination of several variables, including the year type, the timing of runoff, ability to release from storage. We've consulted with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, who has reviewed the proposal and recommends approval and will provide a written recommendation at the November board meeting. The proposed method of acquisition is simply to add this source and use of leased water to the lease agreement that we are working on with the River District that was approved in July. The only elements that would be new would be to identify the timing of this additional use and the amounts. We would also add a condition about limitations on releases and resulting flow rates. I think you might recall that we've heard concerns from anglers on the Frying Pan River about releases being too high and interfering with their ability to wade and fish. So we are considering, and we'll ask the board to approve, including the same limitations that we have on the lease from the Ute Water Conservancy District. The Rule 6 factors, this is a lease of water stored in priority and released for delivery, so historic use and return flows and material injury aren't factors that the board needs to consider. It will promote maximum utilization by beneficial use of preserving and improving the natural environment, supporting recovery of endangered fish, and then it will be available for subsequent use downstream of the in-stream flow reach. And the proposed lease does not negatively impact any interstate compact. The stacking evaluation, it only is a consideration from July 1st to September 30th. The leased water could be combined or stacked with the existing in-stream flow rate to achieve a greater level of protection. Again, trying to help meet those Fish and Wildlife Service recommendations, which will improve the natural environment. We've reached out to the Division 5 engineer about whether this is capable of being administered. Based on our lease of Rudai water, we anticipate Division engineer will conclude that it is administrable, and we will follow up. I suspect he might be out hunting, so it's that time of year. The anticipated benefits of the lease, of using this remaining leased water on the 15-mile reach, will help bring flow rates up to the decreed in-stream flows, help meet the Fish and Wildlife flow recommendations, further the goals of the recovery program, and it both preserve and improve the natural environment. There won't be any additional cost to CWCB to use the remaining water. It's included in the price of the initial lease. And just to update you, the board approved an expenditure of up to $228,775, and the River District is not going to charge the $400 application fee, so we will be spending $228,375. So we saved $400.
Nice.
We will pay with funds authorized by 3760 123.7 construction fund for acquisitions of water for in-stream flow. We've notified council for Southeast District about this additional proposal, and I'm going to follow up with him next week. Touched base with him yesterday. It was convenient in some ways to have everyone here to touch base on other things. We are going to notify the Frying Pan River angling community about this proposal, and we will recommend that those limitations on the releases. And we're coordinating with River District to obtain approval from the Bureau of Reclamation for this additional use. So staff recommendation is that the board consider approving this proposed additional location and times of use for that leased Rudai reservoir for the remaining water, and consider making the necessary findings regarding the amounts of leased water that are appropriate to preserve and improve. And also today, if you have any questions or concerns that you'd like us to follow up on, please let us know, but there is no action required today.
All right, thanks, Linda. And thanks for doing this. This helps me a lot.
We're very happy that we found additional use for this water.
Any Questions or concerns? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Agenda item 31, terms for the sale of CWCB shares in the Chatfield reallocation project. My
Honestly,
mouth's getting
like-
tired.
Thank you for hanging in there, everybody. This is the last agenda item, and I'm Lauren Riss for CWCB staff, for the record. And so this is regarding the sale of shares in the Chatfield reallocation project to Dominion Water and Sanitation District. And just to give you a quick refresher, we talked about the project generally in Finance Committee, but CWCB currently owns just over 6,000 shares that are available for sale in the project out of a reallocated amount of 20,600. And CWCB is currently one of 8 participants in the project. You can see on the slide there, we have Centennial, Center, Central, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Castle Pines North, Castle Pines Metro, Castle Rock, and then we have retained 600 shares for the environmental pool. So you have to have a C in your name to participate in this project, except for, I guess, Dominion. They will be the outlier. Right. Do with that what you would like. So Dominion Water and Sanitation District has been interested really since, just shortly after we kicked the project off in 2015 in purchasing 500 shares through an option agreement with CWCB for over a period of 15 years. CWCB has a current option agreement with a current participant in the project, Castle Rock, where they are purchasing a total of 2,000 acre feet over a period of 15 years. So all along, we've been planning on modeling this agreement after that agreement. However, the difference is that this is the first new participant in the project. Castle Rock was in from the beginning. And so there are a number of agreements that we've had to work on with regard to Dominion to get them into the project. Let's see how to advance this. So just a little bit of background about Dominion. They are a special district that was formed in 2004 to provide wholesale water, wastewater, and stormwater services. They have a service area of about 33,000 acre feet that includes Sterling Ranch, Chatfield Valley Framework entities, and other retail water and wastewater providers. Sterling Ranch is really the kind of the main entity that will be serviced by this project. And that is a current development that is very much still in the construction phase. They're in the process of developing out the first of 9 villages in that community that will be comprised of about 800 homes. They expect about 20 years to reach full build out with eventually 12,000 homes that will house approximately 31,000 people. So a pretty sizable community. And you can see there on the map, and that's also in your board memo, that their service area is just south of Chatfield Reservoir and encompasses Roxborough and Sedalia, although they would not be providing service to Roxborough. So the staff recommendation, and I apologize because I was really hoping this would be a neat and tidy staff recommendation that wouldn't require much discussion, but I'll just give you advance warning that we're going to ask for a little bit of discussion about one of the provisions there that's in green. And I'll save that for last, so I'll go through the others first. So the terms of sale that we are recommending is that Dominion would purchase 500 acre feet of storage space in Chatfield for over a period of 15 years. Dominion would close on 10 acre feet of storage within the first 90 days after the purchase agreement is executed, and thereafter would purchase no less than 33 acre feet per year, commencing 1 year after the closing date. But that would just be a floor, not a ceiling. They could purchase more in any 1 year. Dominion may delay purchase for 1 year up to 5 times without forfeiting the agreement, but not in consecutive years. A request to delay purchase in consecutive years would give CWCB the ability to terminate the agreement. and Dominion will pay the O&M RRR and R costs charged
It's Pirate Day.
by the, I know,
Pirate Day.
that is charged by the federal government for the full optioned acre feet that the CWCB would be holding in. If you're curious what all those R stand for, it is the repair, rehabilitation, reconstruction, and replacement costs. And that amount is currently paid by all of the participants in a proportionate amount relative to their ownership. So the item that I have highlighted in green relates to the price per acre foot. And it seems like every time we have these conversations internally as staff, we realize a new layer of complication to this project and think of things that we wish we'd thought of before. And that is what happened in this case after we drafted the memo, and we've kind of gone round and round about this and have a suggestion for the board. But first, let me explain what is currently in the memo. As I've said before, we've learned that it's really hard to sell something that is not completely built yet. And so what is currently in the staff recommendation is that the price per acre foot would be at $88,300 per share, which is the current construction estimate for the project. So just as a reminder, we're about 1 year in the construction of this project, which is primarily composed of, well, entirely composed of mitigation. And we expect that construction will be completed by Memorial Day of 2019. So we have just about a year left. And then after the core reviews, we would have the ability to store water starting in the spring of 2020. So what's in the staff memo now is that we would sell shares at that current project estimated cost of $8,300. And then after the project is complete and we know what the cost is really, that amount would then be reconciled and we would sell future shares at that actual project cost amount. And we've had a lot of conversations with the state controller about the best ways to proceed in selling something that is only partially an asset and partially a liability, and have mostly worked through that. But you know, in conversations just recently, it has occurred to us that locking in a purchase price for the next 15 years may not be in the best business interest of CWCB. It doesn't account for what the future market would be for those shares. And I have Kirk sitting behind me, and if the board wants to get into any greater depth into that conversation, I'm going to make him come up here because he's more comfortable talking about interest rates and lost revenue than I am. So I'll open it up for discussion, but what our recommendation is at this point is to incorporate, instead of that second provision there highlighted in green, instead recommend that the board direct staff to come back in November with a policy for determining the price of all future sales in the project, and then to base this purchase price for Dominion on that policy, if that makes sense.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Any questions? Director Wells is reaching.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think this is a good idea and a good approach. When people were paying for their shares by getting loans from CWCB or other means, they were paying within a couple of years or so. But this one is sort of 15 years, possibly 20, and that's too long a period of time to have a guaranteed price. What this agreement gives them is a guarantee of 500 acre feet that they don't have to purchase all at once, and that's a pretty good guarantee without also guaranteeing the price. The trick will be trying to figure out what the index should be, but it does seem to me to make sense. We adjust our interest rates on our loans all the time. So at any rate, I think it's a really good idea.
Any other discussion? Director Gallagher?
I would agree with Director Wells, and you could use something like the CCI or some other index, which would be fairly conventional. but certainly not lock in for 15 years or even more than 5 years, or 3 years. Things happen.
Any other? I would agree with that as well, because we're missing out on some opportunity on our money that we're not realizing on this that we would with a loan. So we need to take that into account when we do this.
Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it. And the only other thing that I would just put out there in full transparency is that Dominion is very eager to close this deal. And so we have not discussed with them this change. And so I expect that there will be a little bit of frustration on their part. But I guess from my perspective, it's better to do this right than to rush through and do something that doesn't quite make sense. So
yeah, no, I agree, because we need to think this through, because we could be doing this in the future. So we better be consistent when we do it, and we better do it right when we do it. So I think, the idea of having a policy, how we're going to do this in the future, we just want to make sure we do it right the first time. And so, we apologize for the frustration. This is new to us, and we're trying to figure it out. So they have to bear with us a little bit as we figure it out. And, we need to work with the state controller too, who's trying to figure this out at the same time, selling something that isn't there yet. And so it's a tricky thing for us. So I appreciate your caution.
yeah, thank you.
Director Wells.
If there aren't any further questions, I would move the staff's recommendation as revised in the discussion today for board item 31.
Second. Been moved by Director Wells, seconded by Director Dutton, that we approve staff recommendation as amended on agenda item 31. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we shall proceed to vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that ends our agenda. Pretty close to on time, I think. So nice. Yeah.
Not so good yesterday.
So thanks to all of you for your work and your patience and
Chairman Young, could I
Yes.
just butt in for a second? This is Andrew's last meeting being our board coordinator, and I just want to thank him for taking care of us. And welcome to our new board coordinator.
Yeah. I'm just glad Andrew's not going anywhere. So
Yeah.
that's good.
I'm pretty sure
I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind.
Yeah. So I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Been moved by Director Goebel, seconded by Director Gallagher, that we adjourn this meeting. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, we will vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.